season. And those of you who may be less familiar with the liturgical calendar and liturgical churches might be interested to know that indeed Easter is a 50-day long season. We have 50 days in which to sit with the mystery of the resurrection. And so in light of that, I want to go back a couple of weeks to Easter Sunday itself and talk a bit about the sermon that I read every year at our Easter Vigil. So those of you who are veterans of the Vigil will know this, and if you have not ever come to the Vigil, which you totally should, this is fantastic, plug for next year. But I read what is actually just in the Orthodox Church referred to as the Easter sermon. They have one. And it is by St. John Chrysostom. And it is a beautifully laid out invitation for those gathered in worship to enter into the joy of the Easter feast. And he puts it in the framework of being called to share the banquet. And at one point he talks about, come, you who have toiled from the first hour, or did you only start toiling from noon, come and enjoy the banquet. If you joined at the 11th hour, come into the bounty of the Lord. And it is obviously a reference, for those of you who are familiar with it, to one of Jesus' parables, the workers in the vineyard, where all of those who come to work, no matter what time they begin, all receive a full day's wage. But I think what John Chrysostom is doing by employing that imagery in the invitation to partake of the bounty of the Easter feast is speaking particularly to that abundance, the vastness of the joy, the grace, the triumph of the Easter celebration, the bounty of it. One person getting more, one person who seems to deserve more, getting more does not diminish what someone who seems to have toiled less gets, right? Someone who seems like they don't deserve as much entering in the fullness of the bounty does not diminish what someone else receives. Entering into the joy and the abundance of the mystery of the resurrection is not a zero-sum game, because the abundance of God's grace and love is in fact boundless. And I think it is a powerful push against what is so often the mindset of scarcity that we apply not just to our world, but to our framework of God, and at times even our framework of our relationships with one another. And on this fourth Sunday of Easter, I am intrigued in our reading from John's Gospel that frames Jesus as the Good Shepherd, particularly in that distinction that John draws between the Good Shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep and the hired hand. The hired hand who doesn't really care for the sheep, right? The hired hand who's not going to put himself between a wolf coming from the flock because he's just there to do a job, right? And I think it is a powerful push away from the transactional mindset of grace, goodness, love that we often operate in, and the mindset of abundance that we are invited to adopt as we reflect on the image of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. We were talking about this a bit with the students at our Bible study on Thursday night, And we were talking a little bit about how that image of Jesus as the Good Shepherd kind of conjures up those Sunday school texts, right? The image of Jesus as a shepherd with the little lamb. And I think at times the image of Jesus as the Good Shepherd can conjure that mentality that is a touch twee, a touch sentimental, perhaps. But I appreciate how in our reading from John's Gospel, we are pushed to engage with an image of the shepherd that is a lot more powerful than that, right? This is not a sentimental image of a shepherd with a little lamb, perhaps painted in watercolors, set in, static, in a little painting somewhere in a church basement. But it is an image of the shepherd who knows the sheep, claims the sheep, protects the sheep in circumstances that are actually quite dangerous, right? Protects the sheep from wolves, real, genuine threats. And the shepherd who indeed loves and knows and claims the sheep so much that the shepherd is willing indeed to lay down his life for them. Because there is, in fact, no limit to the abundance and the breadth of the shepherd's care for the sheep. And obviously the framework for this in the Easter season is the image of God's love for us poured out wholly and completely to the extent of the cross. There is no greater act of freedom, indeed, than God's willingness to pour out God's own life for us to the point of complete death. And in fact, triumphing over the reality of sin and death, and calling us into the life and love that cannot be limited, defeated by even the greatest power of sin and evil in our world. It is a powerful, remarkable image of the abundant love of God that we are called to enter into in this Easter season. Indeed, why we have 50 full days to sit with the scope of that mystery and joy, the heart of the good news of our Christian faith and story. And I think it is one thing for us to be able to sit with the fullness and mystery of God's love manifested in that image of the Good Shepherd that pushes against any transactional, limited scarcity mindset of grace. And I think it is another thing altogether for us to live into the call to model it and share it with one another, as we are called to do, and we hear reflected in our reading from 1 John this morning. That the heart of our the commandment that Christ gives us as indeed his flock is the commandment to live into the embodiment of that love in our relationships with one another. And it is something that I think about a lot, because as hard as it is for us to sit with the abundance and the fullness of God's love for us, it is all the harder for us to sit with the trust and the love that we could in fact be loved in such a way by the people we know in our lives. and indeed share that love ourselves. We are, frankly, mortal, limited beings. We have limitations in our bodies, in our energy, in our time, and I think it becomes so easy for us to allow those very real limitations of who we are to impact the way that we live in relationship and community with one another. I cannot tell you the number of times in my pastoral work, both in my capacity as a chaplain with students and non-students alike, that I hear some form of fear and resistance to someone sharing a burden with someone else. Someone who's going through a really hard time and is afraid to tell their friend or their spouse or someone who is supposed to be a support to them. And they're like, I can't put that on them. Like, I can't put that on. That's not fair of me to, like, burden them with my problems. That's not fair. Like, they have their own stuff to deal with. And we are so afraid to live into that sense of abundance, fullness of love with one another. Trusting that there are, in fact, people who love us and care for us just as God loves us and cares for us. And I wonder what it would mean for us to fully and completely embrace the abundance of the love of the Good Shepherd, to trust that we are known in all of our complexity, loved in all of our complexity, regardless of what we think we deserve or how worthy we think we are, and to actually extend that trust and vulnerability to the people in our lives and live into such a sense of love and compassion, trusting that sometimes we are the flock that needs to be cared for, and sometimes we are called to be the ones modeling the love of the shepherd, and what it would look like to transform our community into such an image of boundless and abundant love. I'll end with just my favorite passage from St. John's homily, which captures this sense of abundance so beautifully. Come you all, enter into the joy of your Lord. You the first and you the last, receive alike your reward. You rich and poor dance together. You sober and slothful celebrate together. You who have kept the fast and you who have not, rejoice together. The table is richly loaded. Enjoy its royal banquet. The calf is a fatted one. Let no one go away hungry. May we live as well in the hope and joy of such abundance.